Good morning and welcome to the Full Scottish on this the 11th of August 2024. I'm Douglas MacKenzie, bringing you news from Scotland and around the world, and here to discuss the stories behind the headlines. We have a distinct northeast flavour this morning. First of all, I'm joined by Maureen Watt, a long-standing friend of the programme. As most of you will know, Maureen was MSP for Aberdeen South and North Kincardine and held ministerial posts in the Scottish Government in education, training and health. Welcome, Maureen.
Hi, good morning, Douglas. Nice to be here again.
Also, I'm joined by Richard Thomson, who was SNP MP for Gordon until the constituency was dissolved this year. Previously, he was also SNP group leader on Aberdeenshire Council. So welcome, Richard.
Good morning, Douglas.
We begin the news, as always, with news from Ukraine on this day 900 since Russia's full-scale invasion of the country. Russia said it was evacuating tens of thousands of people from its Kursk region, which had been invaded by Ukrainian troops. Alexei Smirnov, the acting governor, said on the Telegram messaging app on Sunday that he had instructed the head of the Belovsky district of the region in Kursk southwest to speed up the carrying out of orders to evacuate. Local officials detailed the scale of civilian evacuations from towns and villages close to the combat zone. More than 76,000 people have been temporarily relocated to safe places. The state-run TASS news agency quoted an official from the Regional Emergency Situations Ministry as saying at a press briefing. President Zelensky acknowledged for the first time on Saturday that Ukrainian forces were fighting in Russia's Kursk region and said the operation was part of Kyiv's drive to restore justice after Russia's 2022 invasion. The Ukrainian president had previously stayed silent about the operation. In his Saturday evening address, he said he had discussed the operation with the top Ukrainian commander, Oleksandr Syrskyi. He thanked the soldiers involved, saying, "Ukraine is proving that it can really bring justice and guarantees exactly the kind of pressure that is needed, pressure on the aggressor." At least 13 people were injured in the city of Kursk after debris from a destroyed Ukraine-launched missile fell onto a 9-story residential building, officials in the region said on Sunday. Russia's defense ministry claimed it prevented Ukraine from advancing further on the fifth day of the attack into Kursk, according to media. Fighting was said to be taking place in 3 villages between 7 and 11 miles from the international border. Ivashkovskaya, Malaya and Olgovka, similar locations to where Ukraine was estimated to have advanced previously. Russia's FSB domestic security agency imposed a counter-terrorism regime on Kursk and 2 neighbouring oblasts, Bryansk and Belgorod, giving the authorities sweeping powers to lock down an area and impose controls on communications. A man aged 35 and his 4-year-old son were killed in Russian bombardment of Kyiv over Saturday night, Ukraine's State Emergency Service said on Sunday. Along with the 2 killed, 3 other people were injured when rockets hit homes in the capital's Brovary district, authorities said. Russia's nuclear agency on Saturday warned of a direct threat to the Kursk nuclear power station, less than 50 kilometers from the fighting. However, there has been no evidence of Ukrainian forces threatening the plant. There were reports of regional power outages after an electricity substation was hit in the Kursk region. Belarus sent more troops to reinforce its border with Ukraine on Saturday, saying Ukrainian drones had violated its airspace in the course of Kyiv's incursion into the Kursk region. Ukraine's Navy and military intelligence attacked and damaged a former offshore gas platform used by Russian forces in the Black Sea, the Navy spokesperson said on Saturday. 3 people were killed in 2 Russian attacks on Ukraine's eastern front line, Donetsk and Kharkiv regions, local officials said on Saturday. Elsewhere on the front line, Ukraine on Saturday reported the lowest number of combat engagements on its territory since the 10th of June. Well, Every military expert in Europe has had something to say about the objectives in Kursk, and even General Mark Hartling, former commander of US troops in Europe, didn't have a clear answer to what was going on. So I'm not going to ask you for a military assessment unless you have something to offer, but I'm interested in the politics around this. First of all, um, this came out of the blue. There was not a cheep from Ukraine that this was going to happen, which seems a rare thing in modern politics, that governments can totally keep secrets. Russia was clearly taken aback and surprised by it, ignoring reports of troop build-up. And there has been a change in Kursk, as the headline said there, that Putin has put FSB in charge of the area rather than the Ministry of Defense. The incursion started with the Americans demanding an explanation from Kyiv as to what was going on, but later in the day, Miller, the State Department spokesman, said it was an operational matter for Ukraine, and the other country which was typically reluctant for its weapons to be used across the border and had so many red lines was Germany, and the chairman of the Defense Committee in Berlin said, well, once weapons are handed over by Germany, they become Ukrainian weapons. So is this a change in the political outlook in the West, that there is not so much attention being paid to red lines and a serious attempt to help Ukraine to win? Maureen, start with you, please.
Well, I think it's clearly a change in tactics from Ukraine, and I think it's perhaps too early to answer your last question about what Ukraine's supporters in terms of military aid are saying and understand from this. Personally, I think it's probably a smart move by Ukraine to let Russians see exactly what they are doing in Ukraine, and they're getting some of their own medicine, and the fact that the area is being evacuated by Putin's Russia is really interesting. Yes, we will wait and see what the outcome will be and how Russia will respond to this. But clearly, Ukraine, by this move, think they will regain the upper hand.
Thank you. Richard, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I agree with what Maureen says there. I mean, I think it shows two things in the generality. One, that it confirms what we've known for a long time, that the Russian invasion, the military operation, is not going to plan from the Kremlin's perspective. Secondly, I think what it shows is that Russia is not invulnerable militarily, that its resources are also stretched along that very long border. I think you're correct, Douglas, in identifying that the red lines that seem to be amongst many of Ukraine's military backers in the West about the use of munitions in Russia, that red line appears to be faded significantly. But in terms of a broader strategic objective here, it's potentially easy to advance into lightly held territory. It's much harder to hold it long term against determined resistance, if that is what now comes from the Russian military. So is it the intention of the Ukrainians to hold that land and occupy it long term? I'm not sure I understand the value of that at this point. One interesting suggestion that's been made is that it's to divert Russian forces from other areas where they are stronger, or perhaps even that it's a prelude to starting some negotiations in terms of it strengthens the Ukrainians' hand to argue that both sides should retreat to their pre-conflict borders. But I have no idea what's in the minds of the Ukrainian strategists here. But I think it does just go to show that Russia is not invulnerable, and there are significant weaknesses in not just in their military, but also in their political and military leadership.
Thank you both. I'm sure there will be a lot of news on that front in the coming week. Turning now to Gaza. At least 39,790 Palestinians have been killed and 91,702 injured in Gaza since 7th of October. Israel claims that Hamas were operating a command center in the Tabeen school in Gaza as justification for its airstrike, which killed at least 80 people, including women and children, and injured many more. The EU's Josep Borrell said there was no justification for the attack on the school, which was being used to house families displaced by the Israeli attacks. The UN reports that 477 out of 564 schools in Gaza have been directly hit or damaged. I think everyone was horrified and amazed when the first school in Gaza was hit by the IDF in the early days of this, and now, as the UN reports, 477 out of 564 schools have been hit. There seems to be no one who can bring pressure on Israel to change its policy, to move to a ceasefire. What is the way ahead, Maureen?
I think I'd be a very high UN diplomat if I knew the answer to that. A knife means absolutely nothing to Netanyahu, especially the lives of Gazan citizens and especially women and children. I mean, to target a school because they thought that Hamas leaders might be there is just, I mean, I should really no words to describe it. It's just totally unjustified. We're not sure if they managed to find and kill any Hamas leaders. I mean, I've seen some reports that they managed to kill about 10 leaders, but the killing of so many women and children, 80 women and children, just to get 10 Hamas leaders is just totally and utterly unjustifiable. And as you said yourself, Douglas, there seems to be no one who can bring Netanyahu to his senses at all. I think one can only hope that Kamala Harris, if she becomes the US president, will be harder on Netanyahu. Why can I not say that today? Than Biden has been.
Thank you. Richard, your take on this?
Yeah, it's just another day and another atrocity that's been committed. I mean, I think the death toll now, the civilian death toll was approaching 40,000, and I'm numbed almost now, and I hate using that word, and I hate feeling like this, to the scale of the horror that's been visited by Israeli forces on the people of Gaza, who are not responsible for any of this. And the justification for whatever civilian facility that's being destroyed, whether it's a school, whether it's a hospital, whether it's water plants, is always that Hamas are in some way using it. I'm no longer believing any of that. There is a collective punishment that is underway and has been underway, and it continues to be underway because the Israeli government fears no consequence from its actions any longer. And I don't know what the solution to this any longer is. It feels utterly inadequate to say, as we always have to, about the need for peace and a two-state solution. Obviously, that's it. Obviously, the only solution to this is political and negotiated rather than being imposed militarily. But it's quite clear that the violence that is being inflicted on the people of Gaza, no matter how smart the Israeli government say their weapons are, it is bordering on the indiscriminate. In fact, it is indiscriminate. And as I say, they get away with it because they fear no consequence of their actions. And like Maureen, I can only hope that fresh political leadership in the US, in the form of Kamala Harris, hopefully, from my perspective, can perhaps bring to bear some positive outcomes here, where there's been very few positive outcomes. So, in fact, no positive outcomes so far.
Yeah, you both mentioned that you hope things would change with Harris' presidency. Traditionally, the United States has really been the only country which has been able to influence Israeli policies. Do you think that Netanyahu sees Biden as a lame duck president now, so he doesn't need to pay any attention? And Biden knows that there's really nothing he can do, and possibly he will just alienate more people by becoming more involved before the election? Richard,
Oh,
carry on. You were talking about the
yeah,
Harris presidency.
I think there's something in that. Clearly, Netanyahu is well versed in U.S. politics. He lived and worked in the US for for a while as a younger man, I believe. He reads the American political situation very well. Um, and clearly, he can see that there's whatever happens, there's going to be a new occupant of the White House. Therefore, he's not going to be dealing with the present occupant. So I think that reduces any leverage that Biden might have personally. Whether or not that similarly liberates President Biden to say what he really thinks. If he thinks anything different to what he has, the course he's been charting in public, who knows? We may see a changing of the political weather in that sense. But it's going to be the attitude of the US to the Israeli actions in Gaza is going to be determined by one of two people. It's either going to be Donald Trump or it's going to be Kamala Harris, and I think that's what Mr. Netanyahu is going to be orientating his views and strategy towards dealing with, and perhaps favouring one of those candidates significantly more than the other. But whether or not this liberates President Biden to speak more freely on the situation, I don't know. I think it might be rather refreshing if it does.
Thank you. Maureen, would you like to add anything to that on Gaza?
Yeah, well, I agree with what Richard just said. Finally, there, perhaps Biden will feel that he's free to be harder on Netanyahu now. But I mean, as I've said so many times on this program, that Netanyahu clearly just wants to obliterate Gaza and the people of Palestine living in Gaza off the face of the earth, and the fact that they have targeted so many schools. I mean, I think the UN reported 477 schools out of 564. I mean, how does Gaza recover from this when the whole country's just been completely obliterated? He said earlier that he didn't think that his mission in Gaza would be finished until the end of the year, and that's clearly, I think, more and more likely now, unless something is pulled out of the hat by the many countries who are trying to negotiate peace. But these talks don't seem to be making any progress at all.
Indeed. Well, you've both spoken there about the presidential elections in the US, so let's turn to that now. Kamala Harris has enlivened the US presidential race, if nothing else, with a positive and upbeat campaign. She has pulled back and, in fact, overturned Trump's lead in the polls and is slightly ahead herself. And perhaps even more significantly, she now appears to be the bookies' favourite to be the next president. Is this a honeymoon period, or can she build on this momentum to win the swing states, which are crucial to the election, and become president in November? Maureen.
Yes, it's great to see the different way of campaigning that Kamala Harris has brought to the presidential campaign. She's clearly on a roll because financial contributions are rolling into her campaign, and she's set a new tone for it. And I think it's interesting to see that Trump now looks completely deflated. He really doesn't know how to deal with this new kid on the block, if you like. yeah, he's looks deflated. He looks old. He looks raveled, as we would say in the northeast. So it'll be interesting to see the outcome of the first debate, which I think is the in the beginning of September, and whether Trump himself, although he says he wants other debates, whether he will after the first one. So yes, there's still all to play for in this campaign, but personally, I think it's great that to see that Harris is beginning to nudge ahead.
Richard?
Yeah, I think Maureen nails it. Clearly, there's a spring in the step now of the Democrats that was absent a couple of months ago. Kamala Harris is clearly, someone who's very comfortable in their own skin. She's emerging from I don't like the word shadows, but she's stepping up and now beginning to fill the shoes of a presidential candidate. Before she was very much, the number two to President Biden, and as she's moved centre stage, she seems to be made for it. She seems to have unearthed somebody very, very good in Tim Walz as a running mate. They complement each other well. He has an excellent track record as a governor and a legislator. She, of course, has a track record outside politics as a prosecutor. She's clearly well equipped not to take any of Trump's nonsense. Increasingly the broadcasters seem to be getting, his own side seem to be getting frustrated with his lengthy rambles on television and at public meetings. His only thing that he has in his locker is to pretend that he's better at everything than anyone else in the history of the endeavour of human civilization, and to come up with childish nicknames for people. And it turns out, Harris and Waltz are no slouches themselves when it comes to hitting back. But the point on that level, but at the same point, they clearly have achievements outside of politics. They have achievements in politics. They have track records, and they're likable. And I think the thing that's really kind of struck me is the way everyone's latched onto their description collectively of Trump and Vance as being weird. Because I do think that chimes. It certainly chimes with what a lot of us on this side of the Atlantic Ocean might think of them and their political obsessions. But if it's resonating with voters in America and makes them more relatable and their opponents less so, then that can only bode well. Perhaps we're seeing some of that in terms of polling, particularly in some of the crucial Midwest swing states there. And, if they're getting traction, if they're getting a hearing, if they promise something better, and it's not just better than the alternative, but perhaps better than America has been over the last few years generally, and to build on the good work that has undoubtedly happened under the Biden administration. And I think that's what people are going to want to hear, rather than, because I think people are generally tiring of politics as soap opera. And, hopefully this is the last season that we have of Mr. Trump.
Thanks, Richard. You said there better than the alternative. Last time I was on this program, having guests give their views on Kamala Harris, which was just after she had secured the nomination or the necessary votes for it. They were saying, well, yeah, we need to see her policies. She hasn't spoken about them. Has she enunciated policies, or is she just better than the alternative? Can she win on just, well, I'm not Trump?
I think the not Trump is a significant motivating factor, certainly for much of the Democrat base. I think the fact that she's a principled public servant will appeal to a lot of people who perhaps lean Republican, but are appalled at the way that Trump has debased the values of public office, particularly, there's no mark of the man more than the man on which he left office with the botched insurrection that he did nothing to halt. I think probably coming in with too policy-rich a prospectus would simply give Trump and Vance the opportunity to misrepresent that. So I think there is a trend, and I don't particularly care for this, but I can understand why it happens now in politics for people aspiring leaders to present as little of a target as possible when it comes to policies, and to paint in as broad brushes as possible. But I think certainly not Trump is a big motivating factor for a lot of people who lean Republican, as well as particularly the Democratic base. But they are going to have to the Harris Waltz team, they are going to have to outline what a presidency looks like, and for that they have to get beyond the not Trump prospectus, as compelling as that will be for millions and millions of people.
Thanks. Maureen, any more thoughts on the Harris campaign?
Yeah, well, I mean, they've still got to have their convention, the Democrats, haven't they? So she's probably keeping a lot of major announcements, as leaders do, to make at their convention. Sorry. I also think that, it's pretty certain that Harris is a bit more left-wing than Biden, although having listened to a number of his annual addresses, he's pretty left-wing himself, and has introduced some pretty radical for the United States policies. So perhaps her team are thinking about how they present her views, and as I say, I think they will be enunciated in the beginning at the convention.
Thanks. Yeah, you've both mentioned Waltz there in favourable terms, and I'm interested in your view on the importance of the vice presidential candidate. I think the last time I discussed this, I was suggesting, well, it's probably not all that important, and then somebody said the words Sarah Palin, and I think you might be able to substitute J.D. Vance for those words in this campaign. Is Waltz going to make a difference, particularly in the Midwest? Maureen, you want to carry on?
I'm not sure, to be honest. I haven't read enough about Waltz to see what difference he will make. But the initial comments on him do seem positive. But just as before you mentioned her name, I wrote down Palin in my notes here because that's the person I remember of as a running mate who completely destroyed a presidential hopeful. So it's clear that Vance and Trump are from the same hymn book, if you like, and both perhaps are becoming more unpopular, certainly amongst undecideds, and it's undecided and decideds in swing states who have to be convinced. But there's still a long way to go till November, and clearly everybody in any election, and we saw that particularly with the Labour Party here prior to the general election, everybody told not to put a foot or a word wrong in the run-up to the election, and less is more. So we will wait and see what happens in the United States.
Thanks. Yeah, Richard, you spoke favourably of Waltz's policies. It's quite similar to Scotland in the way that he introduced free sanitary products for women in the state, and also free breakfast and school lunches for children, which the Republicans attacked him for. And he said, "Yeah, what a monster I am." So, are these things going to chime nationally, do you think, and help the campaign?
Well, I think the biggest thing that Tim Waltz seems to have in his locker is that he's relatable and he's likable. I've heard him described as being America's dad. He is, and he certainly looks that kind of figure. The sort of he looks a bit rumpled. He's clearly not got a carefully curated public image, and he gets on with it. He's got a career in military service. He was a teacher, and he has, one of the things that really kind of showed his character to me was, finding out that he'd volunteered to set up a to be the teacher in charge of an LGBT group at the school that he taught, to support LGBT and promote allyship there. That's maybe not the easiest thing for a white middle guy to do, but he clearly stepped forward because he thought it was right. Helped people to get through a difficult stage in their life. As a governor, he says that he thinks will work. While they may not transfer out of the state level to national initiatives, this is a guy that clearly does what works. Is compassionate, thoughtful, and regular. Seems to be a regular. As I say, he hasn't gone to get his tea. He hasn't gone to sharpen up his suits. He hasn't been assaulted to death. He comes across authentic, and I think whether it's in Washington or anywhere else, some of the things that we feel that politicians are all very, very scripted, all terrified of going a micrometer beyond what the agreed party line is on anything. We're all so all scrubbed up percent, and it's all a bit bland. So if he finds a way of appearing and relating to people and doesn't seem shy of a scrap, I think people will quite like that. I think that not just the Democratic base, but I think that people will quite like his jib and the sense of humour and the robust but humane approach that he brings to politics. So I'm watching a great deal of him, but what I've seen makes me a fan, and I want to see more of him.
Okay, thank you. The story at the beginning of this week was largely about the far right and marches in England and in Belfast, and the relation of the far right to the right-wing media, which of course is nothing new, goes back to the Mail in the 1930s. And then when counter-protesters came out, we had a headline in the Express, United Britain stands firm against thugs. The Mail wrote, unite anti-hate marchers, face down the thugs. So, more joy in the kingdom of heaven over a sinner who repenteth, or simply expediency on the part of these media outlets? Maureen.
Yeah, well, I've been out of country for the last week, so I've only been reading what I can pick up online on the media. I haven't seen the riots as covered by the TV. So I think it's absolutely appalling. I think the right-wing media should take responsibility for some of it, because clearly, as you say, they've been leading up to it, and now they can't get away from the fact that they are responsible for much of what's happened by trying to change their headlines when within their papers everything is so incredibly right-wing, anti-immigrant, racist, and all the rest of it. So they are reaping what they have sown. I am pleased that Keir Starmer has taken a very hard line, that those who have been arrested and charged have been given long sentences. Whether it will quell it for a bit or for a longer time, we have yet to see. But I think that there are underlying problems in some of the towns and cities where this has happened that need to be addressed, particularly among young white males. And I haven't seen anything so far to see that action is being taken on that.
Yeah, indeed. But having valid political concerns, Maureen, is hardly a justification for smashing the window of Greggs and stealing a tray of steak bakes.
No, absolutely. No, absolutely not. It's not as if the riots have been caused by some heat wave, as you see in some countries. What has sparked it is what has happened on social media, and social media has goaded much of this. But I'm not best placed to say, you know, what has happened, because I haven't read any commentary on it. As I say, I've been out of the country. So, maybe Richard, you've been following it a bit more than I have.
Yeah, good hand over to Richard. Thank you, Maureen.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, I agree. This is going to be a very dull programme. I think I agree with a lot of what Maureen has said about the general contributory factors to this. But I don't think let's not let the Mail and the Express off the hook here. They both had excellent front pages, but one front page doesn't excuse the years of bile, hatred, and incitement that they contributed to over the previous years, in terms of trying to whip up an atmosphere of fear and hatred towards people who, in many cases, were simply trying to come here to escape war, oppression, or simply to try and make a better life for themselves. And they had one page in the aftermath of the riots when it became, when it was obvious where all decent people stood on that. But as I say, you have page after page after page of year after year after year of fear mongering about people who are coming here with nothing. And to be honest, I think there has been a failure of politics here. The Conservatives, clearly, you've got little weasels like Robert Jenrick who've been trying to, make capital out of this. I was half expecting the words there are many fine people on both sides to fall from his lips, just like Trump did after Charlottesville. But we've tolerated people like Priti Patel as Home Secretary. God help us, even Suella Braverman, until even she became a bit too much for the Conservatives, and they have pandered to this, and they have played up to try and create, as they call, a political dividing line. And I'm glad that people have seen through that, have proved resilient to that, and even Farage appears to be backtracking a bit now after posing, trying to pose what he thought were legitimate questions, or what he was trying to hide behind this. Again, another noxious little weasel of a man. So, it's quite clear social media amplified this, but, root causes of, agitation about immigration, usually what it comes back to, you'll get people saying, and it's not that I'm not racist, but it's, they talk about pressures on public services. And if there is a legitimate concern in any of this, it probably is that the perception that or the reality that there's not enough housing, that the health service is under pressure. But where the far right has succeeded, and where some in government have succeeded, is in getting people to blame their neighbours with nothing for this state of affairs, rather than pointing the finger where it really deserves to be pointed at, which is a decade and a half or more of deliberate, orchestrated government austerity, which was made as an ideological choice after the banking crash. And if our public services aren't meeting the levels and the expectations that we have for them, it's because we're not resourcing them well enough, not because people are fleeing war and oppression or trying to make a better life for themselves and their families here. Because we know that particularly in Scotland, we know that we have a shortage of people. We know that we've got a shortage of skilled people. We also have a shortage of people to perform certain occupations. Our doors and our hearts, particularly given our own history of immigration, out-migration and in-migration to Scotland, we, of all people, should be the last to be critical of, given our history of emigration, albeit much of it was enforced. We of all peoples in the world, should be the last to be critical of any people who seek to move elsewhere to build a better lives for themselves and escape the circumstances in the place that they used to call home, because we've done it ourselves. In our Christmas card lists, when we're writing to Australia, to New Zealand, to Canada, to the US, to all the arts and parts of the world, that should tell us of the cost and that we've paid ourselves in terms of seeking a better life in whatever circumstances. And that has it's diminished us in many ways, but immigration enriches us. And I think there's no room for complacency in Scotland. I'm not a Scottish exceptionalist. I don't believe that we're morally superior. I think it's of note that we haven't seen the unrest in Scotland, or for that matter in Wales, that we have across cities in England and in Northern Ireland and Belfast, albeit perhaps for some different reasons there. But nevertheless, I think there is a different tone to the debate here. But I dearly wish that if there is any good can come out of this, it is that we once the lawlessness is dealt with, the underlying factors of why people feel that they had, or why people feel frustrated with the political setup is dealt with. And it's not because the right offering simple solutions to complex problems have the answers, because they don't. But it's only a long-term sustained investment in the services and the social settlement that we all value that can improve our economy, improve our standard of living. And that is what is effectively the safety valve to this. Because when you have a decade and a half of austerity and those cutbacks in public services, when those services end up in some cases being pared back to the bone, the pressures that engenders feed out in very unhealthy ways sometimes. And I think that's a very, very large part of what we saw over the last week or so in England, were fueled by the accelerant of misinformation on social media around the tragedy and the unspeakable tragedy that took place in Southport.
Thank you. You both mentioned the social media, and Richard, you stressed it as an amplifier rather than as a source. And I wonder, in this week where Elon Musk tweeted that Britain was on the brink of civil war, if there should be more government control over social media. I saw also this week that Simon Harris, the Taoiseach in the Republic of Ireland, announced that he would be seeking fines and punishments for owners of social media companies and the companies for not providing sufficient moderation. Is there a place for that in Britain, Richard?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, freedom of speech is a fundamental right, but it's not an unqualified right. And the oft-cited example, albeit from a different technological age, is that you have freedom of speech, but that doesn't give you the right to shout fire in a crowded theatre and expect to be immune from the consequences of that. So, yes, freedom of speech is an important value to be upheld, but it has never been an unqualified right. And the idea of Elon Musk as some kind of bastion of free speech gives me the dry bulk, frankly. And if I were an investor in his companies, my strong advice to him would be to carry on making expensive cars badly for as long as you can get away with it, and stop trying to pose as the defender of free speech, because you're simply being the amplifier of hate.
Thank you, Maureen. Just before we leave this, please, have your thoughts on social media. But I'm also interested, with you being in France the last couple of weeks, lots of Europeans say to me that they're tired of seeing in British papers the rise of the AfD in Germany, the RN in France, and right-wing groups all over Europe, where the British press ignores the right wing in Britain. Did you see anything in France reporting on what was happening in Britain?
Yeah, just on the television, there was obviously it was wall-to-wall Olympics coverage, but it was mentioned, it was covered on the news. But I suppose, like you said, they are more accustomed to having the more right-wing parties than we are. But one thing that I would like to point out, and what I didn't think happened in the coverage here, was getting the Reform MPs, of which there are now 5, on to explain what they thought about the riots. I didn't see any of that. And I would, if the mainstream media were trying to be balanced, they should have had those 5 MPs on all the time explaining what they thought of the riots and what they were trying to do to stop them. And they could have had more influence, I think, on the people who were writing if they chose to do so, but they didn't, which seems to me, their lack of action seems to me just that they were quite happy to see the writing happen. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. Now, speaking of social media, one topic which particularly excites the regular viewers of Broadcasting Scotland is media coverage in Scotland. Every week, the Scottish Government announces initiatives and funding to improve the lives of people in Scotland, and yet the BBC and other so-called mainstream media organisations always seem to lead with stories which are negative about Scotland. UK-wide media only ever picks up on negative headline stories, and most people in Scotland and beyond only ever see a negative portrayal of Scottish life and politics. I think this is probably inarguable, that this is what happens. I'm interested, Maureen, was it always this bad when you were a minister, or is this something that has changed?
I think something has changed. My theory is, excuse me, that at some point Alistair Jack realised that, and all the information that he was getting as Secretary of State for Scotland, suddenly realised that Scotland was more important to England than England was to Scotland. And together with all his right-wing friends and the mainstream media, decided to have an onslaught. And nobody can deny that there has been a complete and utter onslaught of the Scottish Government and the Scottish National Party. And we have seen, as you've said, Douglas, a diminution of anything good about coming out of the Scottish Government being reported on mainstream media. Is that going to change in the run-up to 2026? Absolutely not. It'll probably get worse. But that is why it is still the case that the SNP has the largest number of myths, and if the SNP are good at anything, it's getting out on the doorsteps and getting the message directly to the voters on the doorsteps. We have had a concertina leaflet of the 100 and odd things that the Scottish Government has delivered for the Scottish people since 27. And, we've just got to find other ways of doing it. I do think that there has lots of improvements that can be made by our elected members on the way that they use social media to cover what's good about the work that they do individually and as a parliamentary group and the government. And over the next couple of years, we've got to get much better at that.
Thank you. Richard, please add to Maureen's comments, and also your thoughts on what can be done to project a more realistic view of Scotland.
Yeah, I think I've obviously had a few weeks to reflect on the election just past, but one of the things that I've always felt from the moment the SNP took office in 2007 was that there were some who have almost never accepted the legitimacy of the Scottish National Party, the cause of independence, or in some very extreme cases, the SNP in government at all. But I always felt that it wasn't going to be those sorts of attacks that would eventually, cause issues for the SNP in government. It was if an impression was ever created, either whether justified or otherwise, that we weren't, to use that reductive phrase of Ruth Davidson's that came later on, getting on with the day job, because I think people of Scotland are quite happy to indulge SNP. There's many Scots, of course, want independence. Many want independence, but not quite yet. But the attacks of our opponents would always slide off pretty harmlessly if there was an ongoing perception of competence. And I think that certainly the performance of the Scottish Government has been good. It is generally better in most respects than the governments that we see in other parts of the UK, whether that's the government at Westminster or in the other devolved nations. But what we're able to deliver in Scotland is not immune from the austerity that we've had imposed on us for a decade and a half, because what we get told is, well, if you don't like this policy or you don't think you've got enough money for that, go and use your tax powers, and you use the tax powers and everyone squeals about that. So it's not a very honest set of political attacks that you find on the Scottish government. And but those who would seek to form a government in succession to that would find themselves stuck on exactly the same financial hooks, because they cannot do anything to change the overall resource envelope that's there for so long as they want it to be run by Westminster, and for so long as we don't have much in the way of borrowing power. So I think that's the big issue, that we've run into issues round about that. But also, we've got one newspaper in Scotland that most of the time is supportive of what the SNP is broadly trying to do, whether in government or anywhere else. So there's a constant onslaught that eventually, like water on a stone, you'd see it break down. But also, I think we were not particularly well prepared for muscular unionism when it came along. Now, I don't think muscular unionism will succeed, because it's not where most people in Scotland are. But we've been pretty rotten, I think, in the SNP as a party, at repelling some of the attacks and misinformation about what is actually being achieved in government. And I think one of the things culturally that is a feature of the SNP, certainly over my 3 or more decades in it, is that we're very, very good at waiting for orders and less good at sometimes taking the initiative. So, you kind of wait for the message to come down. And if you're not getting that message sometimes, then it becomes harder to disseminate an alternative to that prevailing media narrative. And, the media doesn't need to report things that are true. Newspapers aren't printed under oath. It is enough for a newspaper to print something simply because another politician has said it. But the rebuttal, I think, has sometimes been a bit too slow, or far too slow in some cases, when it comes around to educational attainment, when it comes to the performance of the health service. Because what the opposition politicians want to be able to do, and they've had some measure of success in this, is that they want to be able to say unchallenged that there's problems in health service and in education, and they want that to be accepted by the population uncritically, so that's what's clanging around inside their heads when they go to cast their votes. And if we don't get a grip of that fairly soon, then I think it's going to make life very, very difficult at the next Holyrood election. So what Maureen said about the Z leaflet, I think that's great. We need more of that. We need people to be equipped with the arguments about where the Scottish Government is succeeding, what the constraints are about it, because we want to make progress on independence. There is no shortcut to it. Many people at the last election were supporters of independence, but they were voting for other parties. Now, why were they doing that? Not because they were completely taken in by what they're read in the papers, because they take it with the same pinch of salt that we do, not because they're taken in by the way that BBC Scotland allows itself to have its political agenda set by the headlines of those papers. But they felt that there were other issues like the cost of living that were important, and where we need to get sharp is to, linking in people's minds the condition of Scotland with the Constitution of Scotland, that why the idea of who decides is one that fundamentally matters in politics, and when it's the people of Scotland who get to decide not just on policies but on the resources to back them up, we make better choices than are ever made for us anywhere else. And that if you want to go beyond that, if you want to break out of that ideological austerity that Labour are signed up to, then you need not just more powers, but the full powers of independence. Now, I've just taken 30 seconds to outline that key bit of that. That's far too long. We need it boiled down by somebody smarter and more articulate than me to get that down to what we need to get across if we're going to make progress on that big issue. But basically, we're being assailed by a cloud of midges at the moment. And I think the only thing that kind of gets rid of that is by people, not just the SNP or the Scottish Government saying what a good job we're doing or that these good things are happening. People actually have to feel and believe that. I think by and large they still do. But if you look at the Scottish Social Attitude Survey that dropped a few weeks ago, you'll see there was a sharp decline in confidence that people in Scotland had in the Scottish Government. Now, that is in contrast to Westminster, where people still trust the Scottish Government and its competence far more than they do anything that happens at Westminster. But previously, the superpower of the Scottish Government run by the SNP was we weren't just twice as good, we were 4, 5, 6 times as good. And we need to look at how we get back to that. Now, partly that's a political messaging thing, partly that's getting the facts through, partly that's rebutting the nonsense that appears there, but it also means tackling people's, it means making sure that we are delivering, so that when we say we're delivering, people believe that, and so that people can actually see those tangible benefits of the services that they use, but not just for the service users, but so that permeates out to don't use those services or aren't using those services because they don't need them at this point in time, but are influenced by what other people say. So I don't underestimate the difficulty of that. We need to do a better job of linking the condition of Scotland with the Constitution of Scotland and how the resources are allocated, and of course the fundamental question of who decides. But we need to get the gloves off, and we need to get much, much better at getting the truth out there about the good things that are actually happening, about the good achievements that are happening, how we're making a positive difference for people's lives. Because it's only if people continue to believe that and vote in order to preserve that, that we will continue to have to be able to be in government, to continue delivering improvements in the way that Scotland is run, and to hopefully give the people of Scotland the confidence to move beyond the constitutional settlement that we have at present.
Okay, thank you very much. Two robust answers there. So finally today, it's the closing ceremony of the Olympics. There have been some great competition, some poignant and touching stories, and no lack of politics within it as well. So, Maureen, you can be our sports correspondent today, seeing you were there. Did you enjoy the games?
Yeah, I mean, it was a huge privilege to be during the Olympics. Honestly, it was really fantastic. And Paris showed itself at its latter best. It was absolutely beautiful, forgetting about the opening ceremony and the rain. The rest of the time, the weather was really quite hot. Yes, I was at two events. I went to the volleyball, men's volleyball, and also I managed to get to the stadium and was there for the 100-meter men's final, which I think is generally been regarded as the best ever. It was the closest ever you could have thrown a sheet all over all the contestants. They were that close at the finishing line, and the atmosphere was absolutely electric. It was difficult to concentrate on everything that was going on in the stadium. You know, there was women's high jump, and there was throwing the hammer, and yeah, it was absolutely great. And the side events as well was absolutely fantastic. They had a big park with countries displaying their wares. They were obviously being used for business activities as well, which I thought was interesting, in cooperation between countries and trade between countries. So there was lots to learn on the side from the Olympics, but I think everyone can agree that it was a great spectacle. Whether you were there or watching it all on television, and of course you get a much wider variety. There's some discussion about whether things like breakdance should be there. Personally, I think it's great. My son did that when he was smaller, younger, but yeah, it was good.
Good, thank you very much indeed. Well, that's it for this week's Full Scottish. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. To everyone who has donated, and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Right now, we urgently need to increase our donations if we are to be able to pay our bills. We face costs of over £4,000 every month, but only receive donations of around £2,000. Please donate whatever you can afford. Thank you to my guests today, Maureen Watt and Richard Thomson. Goodbye to you at home, and thank you for watching, and please join us at Broadcasting Scotland during the week. Thank you and goodbye.